The beginning of change. It was a brisk morning in the quiet town of Greenville, where the first bell rang sharply, signaling the start of the day at Greenville High. The students shuffled into their classrooms, a familiar mix of groggy teenagers adjusting to the routines of the school year. The sound of whispers, muffled chatter, and the shuffle of sneakers filled the hallways, a soft hum that marked the start of the first period. Alana Johnson, a 15-year-old sophomore, entered the classroom with the same quiet determination she carried each day. She wasn't one to seek attention, always in the middle of the room, her dark braids neatly framing a face that held an air of quiet resilience. It wasn't just her thoughtful demeanor that made her stand out. It was the reality that she was one of the very few black students in a school that, at best, tolerated differences, and at worst, ignored them entirely. She was used to it by now. The stares, the whispers, the occasional careless remark. Alana knew her place at Greenville High, and that place was often in the background, unnoticed, or at least unnoticed enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention. It wasn't that she was shy or lacked confidence. Far from it. But she had learned early on that blending in often made life easier. Today's history class was about the Civil War, a unit that always carried the weight of uncomfortable truths. Mr. Reen, the history teacher, was a middle-aged man with a reputation that preceded him. His sharp voice was both commanding and biting, his approach brutal yet oddly magnetic. Some students admired him for his straightforward, no-nonsense teaching style, while others saw a man who enjoyed poking fun at anyone who wasn't quick to speak up, often targeting those who seemed most vulnerable. Alana had encountered his type before, teachers who seemed to have a knack for highlighting her difference, as if her very presence in the classroom was somehow out of place. She wasn't the first student to endure his sarcasm, but she often found herself the target of it more than others. Still, she pushed through. She had learned to focus on the material, keep her head down, and avoid the landmines hidden in Mr. Reen's lessons. As the students settled into their seats, the class began to settle into its familiar rhythm. Alana sat in the middle, her textbook open in front of her. Though her mind wasn't entirely on the pages, she had spent the previous evening studying the chapter on the Civil War, an era that, though she found it interesting, always seemed to make her feel a little uneasy when it came up in class. She couldn't help but feel that, in this room, the topic was somehow too close to her own life, her own experiences. Slavery, freedom, and oppression. Terms that had long been a part of her own history, passed down through generations. Mr. Reen walked briskly in front of the class, tapping his pen against the chalkboard as he gathered the students' attention. His eyes scanned the room, his lips curling into a smirk, as he often did before he posed one of his signature questions. His voice rang out as he clapped his hands together. "All right, let's see who's actually been paying attention to the Civil War unit. Who wants to tell me why the South fought so hard to preserve slavery?" There was a noticeable shift in the room as the students shuffled in their seats, preparing themselves for the usual uncomfortable moment when one of them would inevitably become the focus of Mr. Reen's probing questions. Everyone knew what was coming, but it was always a guessing game of who would be put on the spot. Mr. Reen's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on a few faces before settling on Alana. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Alana's heart sank in her chest, her palms suddenly clammy. She wasn't unprepared. She had read the chapter, highlighted key points, and even written some notes to help her understand the complexities of the topic. But she knew what this question really meant. It wasn't just about history. It never was. "Alana," Mr. Reen said, drawing out her name with a mocking lilt. "Let's see what you've got. Tell me, why do you think the South fought so hard to preserve slavery?" The hush that fell over the class was almost deafening. Alana's classmates shifted in their seats, some of them glancing nervously in her direction. It wasn't the question that made them uncomfortable. It was the way Mr. Reen had phrased it. There was an unspoken challenge in his voice, a challenge that seemed to suggest that, because Alana was black, she should have some unique understanding of the issue that the other students didn't. Her stomach twisted in knots, But Alana took a deep breath and steadied herself. She had studied the material carefully, and she knew her answer. Still, the weight of being singled out in this way pressed down on her shoulders like an unbearable burden. Her room felt like it was closing in around her as she tried to gather her thoughts. "I think it was about preserving their way of life," she said cautiously, her voice soft but steady. The South didn't just fight for slavery itself. They fought to preserve the entire system that upheld their economy and social order. Mr. Reen turned toward the class, his face twisting in a smirk as he repeated her words back to her. "Preserving their way of life," he said mockingly, pacing in front of the class as though he were a judge about to deliver a verdict. "And what exactly does that mean, Alana? You're black. You should understand this better than anyone." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Students shifted awkwardly in their seats, some staring at their desks, others exchanging uncomfortable glances. Alana felt the heat rise to her face, a surge of humiliation burning beneath her skin. The sting of his words struck deep, but in that moment, something else stirred inside her, a quiet anger, a defiance that refused to shrink in the face of his cruelty. Mr. Reen continued, oblivious to or perhaps relishing the tension he had created. "Come on, Alana. Surely you can give us a more insightful answer than that. Or is this topic too uncomfortable for you to handle?" The air in the room grew thick with unspoken tension. All eyes were now on Alana, waiting for her to respond, to shrink away or to rise to the challenge. Her mind raced, but she refused to back down. She clenched her fists, her fingers digging into the edge of her desk as she took another steadying breath. Maybe it was uncomfortable, she thought, but she wasn't going to let him get away with this. "Maybe it's uncomfortable," she said, her voice rising slightly above the silence. "Because you're asking me to explain a system that was built to oppress people like me." The room seemed to freeze as her words hung in the air. She felt the eyes of every student on her, some stunned, others uncertain, but none of them able to look away. The humiliation she had initially felt began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet power she hadn't known she possessed. "Maybe it's uncomfortable," she continued, her voice growing clearer, stronger, "because you're more interested in mocking me than actually teaching this class." The room was silent now, save for the soft hum of the overhead lights, which seemed distant and unimportant in that moment. Mr. Reen's smug expression faltered, his lips parting slightly as if to respond, but no words came. For the first time, Mr. Reen seemed unsure of himself. The classroom, once his domain, had shifted in the space of just a few words. Alana felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't look away. She stood her ground, her gaze locked with his, steady and unwavering. "Maybe you should ask yourself," she added, "why you think it's okay to single me out because of my skin color." It was as if time stopped in that moment. Even the murmurs of the fluorescent lights above seemed to fade into the background. All eyes were on her, and for the first time, the weight of the room felt like a powerful force on her side. She had spoken her truth, and in that silence, the room began to shift. Mr. Reen cleared his throat, adjusting his tie, and turned back to the board. His voice, when it came, was tight, almost strained. "Let's move on," he muttered, but there was no recovering from the moment. His authority, once so certain, had been cracked, and Alana had shown him that it wasn't as unshakable as he had believed. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, but the atmosphere was still thick with tension. As the students packed up their things and filed out of the room, some avoided Alana's gaze altogether, while others exchanged glances, unsure of what to say or do. But one thing was clear: the balance had shifted. The ripple effect. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period, but the usual rush of students quickly dissipated. The classroom, once alive with the shuffle of backpacks and the chatter of classmates, was eerily quiet. The weight of what had just unfolded hung in the air, thick and palpable. Alana's heart was still racing as she gathered her belongings, her hands trembling slightly as they closed around the edges of her notebook and pencil case. She could hear the soft murmur of voices outside the door, the flow of students on their way to the next class. But in her mind, everything felt suspended, caught between the sharp words of her teacher and the deafening silence that had followed her bold declaration. As she stood up to leave, she couldn't help but notice the furtive glances of some students who had lingered in the hallway, perhaps waiting for a chance to approach her, to talk about what had just happened. Alana didn't look at them. Instead, she kept her head high, the same quiet determination in her stride that had carried her through every other day. Today, though, it felt different. Today, something had shifted. She walked down the hall with the usual swirl of thoughts and worries. Her classes, her homework, the looming questions about how Mr. Reen would react. But there was also something else growing inside her, a quiet, steady feeling that she couldn't quite define but knew was there. By the time she reached the cafeteria, the whispers had already started. They buzzed in the air, catching her attention as she walked through the double doors. Students huddled in groups, talking in low voices, eyes flicking toward her whenever she passed. She didn't need to overhear the words to know what they were saying. Alana had lived with the weight of rumors and whispers for years. But today, she felt oddly indifferent to it. She had spoken her truth. She had done what so many before her hadn't had the courage to do. "Alana, over here," Lee called from their usual table in the far corner of the cafeteria. Lee's voice, loud and full of excitement, cut through the tension like a sudden burst of sunlight. As always, Lee was the life of the table, her infectious energy bringing light to even the most awkward moments. Jasmine, her other close friend, was already seated, her eyes wide with anticipation. As Alana walked toward the table, she couldn't help but feel the heavy gaze of a dozen students on her back. But when she sat down, the warmth of Lee's greeting and Jasmine's wide grin helped to ease the tightness in her chest. "Girl, did you really say that to Reen?" Lee whispered urgently, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Everyone's talking about it. You know the whole school's got their eyes on you now." Alana managed a small smile, though the excitement from her friends didn't fully calm the swirling thoughts in her head. "I don't know if I'm a legend," she replied quietly, shaking her head. "I just couldn't stay quiet anymore." Jasmine leaned forward, her face lighting up with admiration. "You've got guts, Alana. Seriously, he deserved to be put in his place. You've been dealing with his nonsense for so long. It's about time someone called him out." Alana looked at her friends, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. For a brief moment, she considered the consequences. What if Mr. Reen retaliated? What if other teachers sided with him? What if the administration decided she had overstepped? The thought of being isolated, even more than she had been before, sent a shiver down her spine. But then she remembered the way she had stood her ground. The way her voice had rung out clearly, despite the weight of the room pressing against her. She had spoken her truth, and no matter what happened next, she knew that she had done the right thing. "I just couldn't let it slide," Alana said softly. "It's like, every time he does something like that, he gets away with it. And I let him. But today, I wasn't going to let him do that to me anymore." Jasmine nodded in agreement. "I can't believe he said that to you. It's like he thinks you're just supposed to know about slavery because you're black. How messed up is that?" Lee's expression grew more serious. "He doesn't even see it, though. He's so caught up in his own power that he doesn't realize the harm he's causing. He made you the target, but you turned it around on him. He's not gonna know what hit him." Alana took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. The voices of her friends were comforting, but the reality of what had happened was still sinking in. She hadn't just confronted Mr. Reen. She had challenged the culture of complacency that had allowed his behavior to go unchecked for so long. Her friend's encouragement helped, but there was still a part of Alana that was afraid. Afraid of what would happen next. Afraid of being seen as the troublemaker, the one who had rocked the boat. But then, as the noise of the cafeteria buzzed around her, a small flicker of something else began to grow inside her. Something like hope, like the first hint of a revolution that started in the quietest of spaces. And then it happened. By lunchtime, Alana had become the talk of the school. Her encounter with Mr. Reen had spread like wildfire. Whispers rippled through the halls, muting conversations at the lockers and under the fluorescent lights. Some students were in awe of her courage, while others were hesitant, unsure whether to support her or remain silent. But the more Alana walked through the hallways, the more she noticed something strange. Students she didn't know began to approach her, offering quiet nods of approval or simple gestures of support. A shy sophomore from her math class, who Alana had barely spoken to, caught her eye and smiled, mouthing, "Thank you." It was then that Alana realized that what she had done was more than just standing up for herself. She had sparked something in others, a quiet revolution of their own. They didn't have the same voice, or maybe they weren't ready to speak up just yet, but Alana's courage had given them something they hadn't known they needed. The knowledge that they, too, had the right to stand tall in the face of injustice. The next class, English, was a blur. Alana could hardly concentrate on the discussion about To Kill a Mockingbird, though she had read the book before and could quote it with ease. Her mind kept drifting back to what had happened that morning, replaying her words to Mr. Reen and wondering what the aftermath would bring. But as she walked through the hallway between classes, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. A group of students who had once been silent, often quick to laugh or stare when the topic of race came up, were now talking in hushed voices. One of them, a senior named Isaac, caught her eye as she passed. Isaac had always been one of those students who blended into the background, neither popular nor outcast, but he had always kept his distance from Alana. That day, though, as their eyes met, Isaac gave her a quick nod, a silent acknowledgement that meant more than any spoken word could. Her mind raced. Had she just seen the beginning of a change? Was the courage she'd shown in confronting Mr. Reen starting to ripple outwards, creating waves that were pushing against the tide of silence? But the moment didn't last long. As quickly as it had happened, the bell rang, signaling the start of the next period. Students rushed to their classes, and Alana felt the weight of the day pressing against her. There was still so much to process, so many emotions still unspoken, so many questions left unanswered. But one thing was certain: the world around her was shifting, ever so slightly, and she had started the movement with her own voice. The ripple effect had begun, the unseen impact. The days following her confrontation with Mr. Reen felt like they had blurred into one long stretch of uncertainty. Alana's steps through the hallways of Greenville High were a mixture of defiance and caution. Every time she turned a corner, every time she passed by a group of students, her heart would beat just a little faster. The eyes that followed her weren't just curious anymore. There was a weight to them now, a weight that she hadn't noticed before, and yet couldn't escape. The immediate aftermath of her words had been a quiet, tense lull. The expected fallout hadn't arrived yet. Mr. Reen had not directly addressed the incident, nor had anyone from the administration pulled her aside for a conversation. It felt like everyone was waiting for something, waiting for her to slip, waiting for her to back down, or perhaps waiting for her to regret speaking out. But Alana wasn't backing down. Her friends Lee and Jasmine continued to offer their unwavering support, but she could sense the shift in the school atmosphere, the subtle murmurs that now followed her wherever she went. Teachers, too, seemed to look at her differently. Some smiled a little too forcefully, others avoided her gaze altogether, but all of them seemed aware of the spotlight that had inadvertently been placed on her. It wasn't just her peers who were talking. The teachers in the staff room, too, had begun to notice the change, even if they hadn't directly discussed it with her. There were murmurs about that moment in history class and how it had made waves through the student body. Alana hadn't intended for this to happen. She had just wanted to stand up for herself in that moment, to defend her dignity. But now, it seemed like she had started something bigger, something she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for. One afternoon, just days after the incident, Alana was walking to her locker when she noticed a crowd of students gathered near the bulletin board. There was a hum of curiosity in the air, as though something was unfolding. As she approached, her eyes caught a flyer pinned to the wall. At first, she thought it was just another advertisement for a club or upcoming event. But then she saw the title. Student Voices for Change. An open forum on race and inclusion. Her breath caught in her chest as she read the flyer, the words standing out starkly against the usual buzz of high school advertisements. The forum was being organized by a group of students from various grades who had decided it was time to create a space for open dialogue about race, inequality, and the subtle yet pervasive racism that had always simmered beneath the surface of their school. The flyer didn't explicitly mention Alana or the events of the previous week, but it didn't need to. The timing, the topic, it was clear that her actions had sparked something much larger than her confrontation with Mr. Reen. Alana stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. She felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. This was a step forward, a moment of progress. But it was also a risk, one that could bring unwanted attention, and perhaps even more scrutiny. What if she was expected to speak? What if people began looking to her as the voice of this movement, when all she wanted was to go unnoticed? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Lee. "Did you see the flyer? Are you going to the forum? You should, you know. They want you to be there." Alana's fingers hovered over the keys, unsure of how to respond. She had never been the outspoken type. She had never been the one to demand change. But something about this moment, something about the way she had stood up to Mr. Reen, made her wonder if she had the strength to do more. The next day, she walked into the student forum with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She had debated for hours the night before whether or not she would go, but something had nudged her to show up. There was no turning back now, she thought. The choice had been made. The room was filled with a quiet energy when Alana entered, a room full of students who were equally unsure and hopeful. There were a few familiar faces, and a few she didn't recognize, but the common thread was clear. They had all come to discuss the issues that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. Issues of race, privilege, and the subtle ways in which prejudice could permeate every corner of their lives, school, home, and beyond. The forum began with introductions, students sharing why they had come. Alana listened intently, but it wasn't until one of the organizers, a senior named Mia, stood up to speak that the room fell into a complete hush. "Some of us know exactly why we're here," Maya said, her voice strong yet welcoming. "But others of us are still figuring it out. We know that this school, this community, isn't as welcoming as it should be. We know that racism is alive and well, even if it's subtle, even if it's hidden behind the walls of classroom jokes, behind the silent stares, behind the words that are never spoken aloud. We know that these issues need to be addressed." Alana felt a shiver run down her spine. Maya's words resonated deeply with her, far more than she had anticipated. The weight of what had been said was impossible to ignore. Mia paused for a moment, letting the words settle before continuing. "This forum is for everyone, whether you've experienced racism firsthand or have just seen it happen. It's time for us to come together and have real conversations about how we can make this school a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of the color of their skin." Alana's heart was pounding. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, and the pressure to speak was almost unbearable. But she had already said what needed to be said in history class. She had already taken her stand. "Alana, would you like to share something?" Mia's voice broke through her thoughts, and she realized that everyone was looking at her. It was as if time stopped for a moment. Alana's palms grew clammy. She hadn't prepared for this. She had come to listen, not to speak. But in that instant, something in her shifted. She had already spoken once, hadn't she? She had already stood her ground in front of Mr. Reen. What was stopping her from doing it again? Alana stood up slowly, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She took a deep breath, gathering the words she needed to say. I didn't expect to be asked to speak," Alana began, her voice wavering at first. But as she looked around the room, she saw the faces of her classmates, many of whom were nodding along. The kindness in their eyes gave her the courage to continue. I think this school, we all know it's not perfect. We've all seen the things that happen, the jokes that are made, the way some of us are treated differently because of the color of our skin. She paused, her voice growing steadier with each word. And I think we all know that it's not okay. But what happened to me in history class, that was the moment I realized that if we want things to change, we have to be the ones to speak up. She took a deep breath, meeting the eyes of everyone in the room. I don't have all the answers, but I know this. If we don't stand together, nothing's going to change. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. And then, one by one, the students began to applaud. It wasn't a loud, boisterous cheer, but rather a quiet, respectful acknowledgement of her courage. In that moment, Alana realized something that would stay with her forever. Change doesn't come from waiting for others to speak up. It starts with one person, one voice, and that voice could be hers. The courage to lead. The days following the student forum felt surreal to Alana. What had started as an isolated incident, a single moment of standing up to Mr. Reen, had sparked something much larger. The forum, while only a few hours long, had ignited a fire within her that she couldn't quite explain. The way the students had come together, sharing their experiences, their frustrations, and their hopes for change, made her realize that her voice, her quiet, often overlooked voice, had power. The weeks that followed were filled with whispers, stares, and even a few nods of approval from the students who had attended the forum. It wasn't just that they admired her courage, though that certainly played a part. What they admired most was that Alana had dared to confront the system, to challenge the subtle but deeply ingrained racism that shaped their school culture. Her honesty, her vulnerability, and her refusal to let the status quo stand had ignited something within them. A quiet rebellion, perhaps, but a rebellion nonetheless. But for Alana, the aftermath wasn't as clear-cut as it seemed. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel like a leader. What she felt was a deep responsibility, a weight that had settled in her chest, making each new day feel like a step forward into unfamiliar territory. She had taken a stand. Yes, but now what? What was the next step? The first test of her newfound role as an advocate for change came when another incident occurred. It wasn't as dramatic as her confrontation with Mr. Reen, but it was equally troubling. A group of students in her grade had been making crude jokes in the hallway, poking fun at the way certain teachers pronounced words or mocking the way some students dressed. The jokes had a sharp edge to them, and Alana immediately recognized the tone. It was the familiar, insidious kind of humor that came with racism veiled in a guise of, "just kidding." At first, Alana considered walking past it, pretending she hadn't heard the cruel remarks. But as she heard one of the students, someone she didn't know well, but had seen around school, laugh loudly, her conscience wouldn't let her ignore it. She paused, standing a few steps away, trying to decide what to do. The other students didn't seem to be doing anything about it. They were either laughing along or pretending not to hear. But Alana knew something had to be done. She took a deep breath, walking toward the group. They stopped laughing as she approached, some of the students glancing at each other nervously. "You know," Alana began, her voice calm but firm, "what you just said isn't funny. It's hurtful." She felt her pulse quicken as she spoke, but she forced herself to hold steady. It perpetuates the idea that it's okay to mock people for who they are, for the way they talk or the way they look. It's not okay, and it never will be. The group of students shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Some looked away, clearly embarrassed. A few muttered under their breath, trying to laugh it off. But Alana wasn't finished. "I'm not asking you to change who you are," she continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "But I am asking you to think about what you say and how it affects others. It's easy to make a joke, to dismiss someone, but it's harder to be kind, to respect people for who they are, not for who you think they should be." The hallway was silent for a moment, and Alana could feel the weight of the room shifting. No one spoke, no one moved, Finally, one of the students, a girl she vaguely recognized from her math class, sighed and muttered a quiet apology. "Yeah, I guess. We didn't think about it that way," she said, her voice lacking the usual defensiveness. "Sorry." Alana nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest, but a quiet sense of accomplishment washed over her. It wasn't a victory that would change the entire school, but it was a small step, an opportunity to change minds, one conversation at a time. And for the first time, Alana realized that this was what it meant to lead. Leadership wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it was about showing up in the small moments, the quiet moments, and finding the courage to speak up when others wouldn't. By the time the final bell rang that day, signaling the end of the school day, Alana felt the weight of her actions settling in. She had spoken out in the classroom, in the forum, and now in the hallway. Each time she did, the burden grew heavier, but so did her sense of purpose. The thought of change, of creating a space where people could be heard and seen, was no longer a distant idea. It was a reality she was actively shaping. But with this growing responsibility came new challenges. The next day, Alana found a message waiting for her in her inbox, an email from the school principal, Mrs. Carter. The subject line read, "Meeting request." Alana's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected this. Mrs. Carter was a figurehead, a distant authority figure who had always kept a low profile, but the thought of her reaching out made Alana's nerves spike. She opened the email cautiously, her eyes scanning the words. "Dear Alana, I would like to meet with you to discuss your recent participation in the student forum and some of the comments you made regarding the classroom environment. It is important that we have a conversation about these issues in person. Please come by my office during lunch tomorrow." The message was polite, formal, and professional, but there was no mistaking the tone beneath the words. Alana's actions had caught the attention of the administration, and now she would have to face the consequences, whatever they might be. For a moment, a wave of anxiety washed over her. What would Mrs. Carter want to discuss? Was she being reprimanded for her comments in the forum? Would the school consider her actions a form of insubordination? What if they decided to punish her in some way, to silence her voice before it could grow any louder? Alana took a deep breath, pushing the worries from her mind. She had already confronted one authority figure in her life, Mr. Reen, and survived. She had stood up in the face of discomfort and challenged the status quo. Whatever Mrs. Carter had to say, Alana would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. The next day, at lunch, Alana found herself walking toward the principal's office, her thoughts swirling with uncertainty. But as she stood in front of the door, she realized that this was another test, another chance for her to stand firm, to speak her truth, and to make sure that her voice continued to be heard. Mrs. Carter's office door opened, and Alana stepped inside, her heart steady, but her nerves alive with anticipation. The conversation ahead was uncharted territory, but it was a conversation Alana knew she needed to have. "Alana," Mrs. Carter said, her voice warm but businesslike, "I'm glad you could make it. Please, have a seat." As Alana took a seat across from the principal's desk, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she also knew something important, something transformative, was about to unfold. In this new chapter, Alana would not just be an observer. She would be an active participant in the change she wanted to see in her school, in her community. And she was ready, even if she didn't yet know the full scope of what that meant. The road to change. Alana took a deep breath as she sat across from Mrs. Carter, her heart beating just a little faster than usual. The principal's office, with its polished wood furniture and framed achievements on the walls, felt much more intimidating than usual. She had never had a personal meeting with Mrs. Carter before, and the weight of the past few weeks pressed heavily on her chest. The principal's expression was kind but measured, as though she had already made her mind up about Alana, or perhaps was still weighing her options. Mrs. Carter was a woman of few words, but there was something in her eyes that gave Alana a glimmer of hope. Maybe it was the softness in her gaze, a hint of understanding. Maybe it was because Mrs. Carter had been in her shoes before, long ago. "Alana," Mrs. Carter began, leaning forward slightly. "I've been following your recent involvement in the student forum, and I wanted to speak with you personally. I know you've sparked some important conversations around here, and I wanted to make sure you understood how significant your voice is. What you said in that forum, it hasn't gone unnoticed." Alana nodded but stayed silent, unsure of where the conversation would go. She had expected a reprimand, maybe a warning about stepping out of line, or some suggestion to tone it down. She had seen this kind of thing happen before. When students spoke up too boldly, they were often made to feel like troublemakers. But Mrs. Carter's tone didn't feel punitive. Instead, there was something else, something closer to curiosity. "You've done something many of us don't see enough of in this school, Alana," Mrs. Carter continued. "You've shown us that the issues of race, identity, and privilege can't be swept under the rug any longer. You've been brave enough to speak about things that make people uncomfortable, and let me be clear, that's not something many people are willing to do." Alana's throat tightened slightly. She had known that her words would have an impact, but hearing Mrs. Carter acknowledge that, hearing the principal herself speak so candidly about the discomfort the conversations were causing, made the weight of her actions feel even more significant. However, Mrs. Carter's voice grew more serious. "I also want to make sure that you're prepared for the consequences of raising these kinds of topics. It's not always going to be easy. You've likely already felt some of the tension in the school. Not everyone agrees with the conversations you're starting, and not everyone will." Alana felt the knot of anxiety in her stomach tighten. She had been bracing herself for this. The idea that she could be silenced or shunned for speaking out was a reality she had been trying to avoid. But she also knew, deep down, that this wasn't something she could turn back from. Her voice had been raised, and she wasn't about to quiet it now. "I understand," Alana replied, her voice steady but quiet. "But I also know that if we don't talk about these things, nothing will ever change. We can't just keep pretending that everything is fine." Mrs. Carter paused, looking at her carefully, as though weighing Alana's words. There was a long silence between them, before the principal gave a small nod. "I admire your conviction, Alana," she said softly. "But understand this. It's going to take more than just speaking up. You've made the first move, but change is a long process. It requires patience, persistence, and yes, sometimes it requires sacrifice." Alana wasn't sure what to say to that. Change had always seemed like an abstract concept to her, something that happened in big moments, in historical events, something she read about in books, but never saw in real life. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had already begun to change things, if only in small, subtle ways. The forum, the hallway confrontation, her words to Mr. Reen. Each time she spoke up, she was contributing to the larger conversation, to the eventual shift in the culture of Greenville High. "I'm not going to stop," Alana said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know it's going to be hard, but I can't just sit back and pretend everything's okay. I don't want to be the only one who's brave enough to say something. If we don't challenge the way things are now, nothing will ever get better." Mrs. Carter looked at Alana for a long moment, her face unreadable. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. "I can see you've thought this through," she said slowly. "And I won't stand in your way. But I will tell you this, there's a way to push for change and still be heard. You don't have to fight every battle on your own. You don't have to take on the entire school by yourself. There are people here who want to support you, but you have to be willing to work with them." Alana blinked, surprised. "What do you mean? Who's going to support me?" Mrs. Carter smiled just a little, though it was tinged with sadness. "There are teachers who believe in what you're doing. There are other students who feel the same way. But you can't change things alone, Alana. If you want this school to be different, if you want your voice to truly matter, you need to build a community of people who will stand with you. You need to find others who will fight for the same cause, who will amplify your voice, and who will be there when it gets hard. Alana felt a spark of something new, hope, perhaps, or a renewed sense of purpose. She hadn't been thinking about building a community. She had been so focused on her own words, her own courage, that she hadn't considered the importance of collaboration. It made sense now. Change wasn't something she could do alone, but it was something that, with enough voices, could create a force powerful enough to reshape everything. The conversation continued for a while longer, and Mrs. Carter shared her thoughts on how Alana could approach the issues at hand, how to navigate the inevitable backlash, and how to build the support she needed to make a real difference. By the time Alana stood up to leave, she felt both overwhelmed and inspired. Mrs. Carter had given her something she hadn't realized she needed: a map for how to keep going, how to keep pushing even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. As Alana walked out of the office, she felt like a weight had been lifted, but another weight had been placed on her shoulders. It was a different kind of responsibility. The responsibility of leadership, of guiding others through the same challenges she had faced. She left the principal's office with a new sense of purpose, her mind already racing with ideas. What if she could organize a student group, a coalition of like-minded students and teachers, to continue the work she had started? What if she could turn her small moments of resistance into a larger movement, something that could truly change the culture of the school? The world outside the office felt different now. Alana had stepped into the role of leader, and though the path ahead was filled with challenges, it was also filled with possibility. And she wasn't walking it alone. In the weeks that followed, Alana began to rally other students who shared her vision. She spoke to Lee and Jasmine, who were eager to help, and slowly more students joined the cause, some who had attended the forum, others who had witnessed the changes that were starting to take place. They met in small groups after school, discussing plans for raising awareness, organizing discussions, and challenging the status quo in meaningful ways. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks. Not every student was on board. Not every teacher was receptive. But with each step, Alana's resolve grew stronger. She was no longer just a student waiting for things to change. She was part of the change. And in the process, she realized something fundamental: the fight for equality, the fight for justice. It wasn't about grand gestures or public victories. It was about the quiet persistence of speaking up, day after day, and the courage to stand in the face of adversity. The change she wanted to see in the world, in her school, was already unfolding. And now, with her community behind her, there was nothing that could stop it. The power of unity. The weeks that followed Alana's meeting with Mrs. Carter unfolded like a series of small yet powerful steps toward something larger than she had initially imagined. Each day brought new challenges, new voices, and new opportunities. What had started as a solitary act of defiance in a history classroom was beginning to ripple outward, affecting more students and teachers than Alana could have anticipated. But the road was far from smooth. There were moments when it felt like the weight of it all might overwhelm her. The pressure to lead, the uncertainty of the future, the skepticism from some students and faculty who weren't yet ready to confront the uncomfortable truths of racism. Despite the obstacles, Alana knew she was no longer walking this path alone. She had gathered a group of committed students, a coalition of voices, each one bringing something unique to the table. Together, they formed the backbone of a movement that was beginning to challenge the complacency that had defined their school for so long. Alana's first official step in organizing a more structured initiative came when she, Lee, Jasmine, and a few others formed a student-led committee dedicated to fostering dialogue on race and inclusion. It wasn't just about speaking out against injustice. It was about creating spaces where every student could feel heard and understood, regardless of their background. The committee met weekly after school in the library, a place that had always felt a little too quiet, a little too distant from the rest of the school. But now it became a gathering spot, a place where ideas were exchanged, plans were made, and a sense of community grew stronger with each meeting. One of the first things they decided to do was organize a school-wide event focused on racial awareness and inclusivity. a day of dialogue. They wanted to bring together students and teachers in an open forum where they could discuss the issues that mattered to them, challenge assumptions, and listen to each other's experiences. It wasn't going to be easy, and it was bound to stir some discomfort, but Alana was determined. She had already seen the power of one voice in that history classroom. Now, she wanted to amplify the voices of others who had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. "I know this isn't going to be a walk in the park," Alana said one afternoon, standing in front of the committee. "But we've already started something. We've already opened the door. This event is our chance to push the conversation further, to get people to think, to feel, and to act. We're not just doing this for us. We're doing it for everyone who's ever felt invisible here." Jasmine nodded, her usual mischievous grin replaced with a rare look of determination. "Exactly. We're not asking people to agree with everything we say, but we are asking them to listen, to really listen. And maybe, just maybe, that'll get them thinking." Lee, always the optimist, added, "I'm telling you, people don't know what they don't know. A lot of the kids here don't realize the impact of their words or actions until they hear it from someone else. If we can just get them to see it from our perspective, it'll make a difference." But as the planning continued, Alana could sense the weight of the resistance that was beginning to build in the background. Not all of their classmates were on board. Some students remained dismissive, uninterested, or outright hostile to the idea of confronting racism in a real and meaningful way. The buzz of whispers had started again in the halls, this time less of admiration and more of skepticism. In the days leading up to the day of dialogue, Alana began to feel the pressure mounting. Every conversation seemed to come with a silent challenge, every glance from a peer laced with judgment. And then came the rumors. A group of students, mostly upperclassmen, began to circulate whispers that the event was nothing more than an attempt to divide the school, to create unnecessary tension. They claimed that it wasn't racism that was the problem, but sensitive snowflakes stirring things up. Alana could feel the heat rising in her chest every time she heard these comments. But this time, she wasn't going to back down. She had worked too hard, alongside her committee, to create an event that could genuinely make a difference. The closer it got to the event date, the more resolute she became. If the school was going to change, it would have to happen from within, from the students themselves. The morning of the event, the cafeteria buzzed with a strange energy. Some students wore bright, supportive t-shirts with slogans like "Unity in Diversity" and "Let's Talk." Others, those who were skeptical or unwilling to engage, sat quietly at their tables, muttering among themselves. Alana couldn't help but notice how divided the school seemed that morning. It felt like the entire atmosphere had shifted in the days leading up to the event. Lee and Jasmine stood by her side as they entered the cafeteria, the place where the event would be held. The long tables were now transformed, with posters on the walls, small discussion groups set up in different corners, and large banners proclaiming, "A safe space for dialogue." Teachers had agreed to moderate some of the sessions, and the entire event had been structured to allow for open conversation about race, stereotypes, and inclusion. As Alana stepped to the front of the room to welcome everyone, her heart thudded against her ribs. She could feel the eyes of the students on her, the weight of expectation heavy on her shoulders. But she refused to let the anxiety win. "Good morning, everyone," Alana said, her voice calm but steady, the microphone picking up the quiet strength in her tone. "I want to thank you all for being here today. This isn't just an event. This is a chance for us to have real, honest conversations about the things that affect us every day. It's about making this school a better place, for all of us." She paused, scanning the room. A few students were fidgeting, clearly uncomfortable, but many others were leaning in, listening intently. Alana's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "We're not asking you to agree with everything we say today, but we are asking you to listen. We want to hear your thoughts, your experiences, and your perspectives. Because only by coming together can we start to understand one another." Only by facing these difficult conversations head-on can we begin to create the change that we need. The room remained quiet for a long moment, and Alana could feel the tension in the air. But then, slowly, some students began to nod, others exchanged glances, and a few even clapped, tentatively at first, but with growing energy. Over the next few hours, the cafeteria became a place of heated discussion and reflective listening. Students and teachers shared stories, some deeply personal, others more observational, about their experiences with race, privilege, and discrimination. There were moments of discomfort, moments of silence, and moments of genuine understanding. But there was also something else, a collective realization that this wasn't an issue that could be ignored any longer. It wasn't just about one student standing up against a teacher. It was about a community coming together to challenge its own assumptions and prejudices. By the end of the day, Alana felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. But it wasn't just physical fatigue. It was the kind of exhaustion that came with knowing she had done something that would matter long after the day had passed. The day of dialogue hadn't solved all the problems of the school, but it had opened the door to something far greater. A commitment to continuing the conversations, a realization that change required more than just words. It required action. As Alana left the cafeteria, her heart full but heavy, she realized that the real power of what they had done wasn't in the event itself. It wasn't in the speeches or the discussions. It was in the connections that had been made, in the stories that had been shared, and in the collective commitment to keep the conversation going long after the event was over. It was in the unity they had created, a unity that wasn't based on agreement, but on understanding. And that, Alana knew, was just the beginning. The lasting impact. As the weeks passed following the day of dialogue, the effects of the event began to settle into the fabric of Greenville High, much like the quiet ripples that follow the drop of a stone into still water. Alana walked through the halls with a quiet sense of accomplishment, though it wasn't the kind of achievement she had anticipated. The school hadn't transformed overnight. The conversations hadn't turned everyone into activists, and the change hadn't been immediate. But the event had opened eyes. It had shifted perspectives, challenged assumptions, and brought people together in a way that had never happened before. Alana was careful to remain grounded in the realization that lasting change took time. She didn't expect people to change their views all at once. Some students had begun to approach her with more openness, asking questions and seeking guidance. Others, however, had retreated further into their discomfort, unwilling or unable to engage with the challenges that had been laid before them. But that was okay. Alana understood now that change didn't always come in grand gestures or sweeping reforms. Sometimes it was the small, quiet acts that made the most difference, the moments when one person took the time to listen, when one person had the courage to ask difficult questions, or when a conversation sparked the first hint of introspection. Through it all, Alana found strength in the people who had walked alongside her in this journey. Lee, Jasmine, and the rest of the committee had been unwavering sources of support. They had helped carry the load when it felt too heavy, offering encouragement and sharing the weight of the work. They had created something together, not just an event, but a network of allies, a community of individuals who were now committed to carrying the conversation forward, even when it was uncomfortable. At the end of the school year, a final assembly was called to reflect on the impact of the day of dialogue. Mr. Reen, though still somewhat distant from Alana, had surprised her by acknowledging the importance of the event. He had been uncomfortable at first, but Alana noticed that he seemed to have changed in subtle ways. He listened more carefully, avoided making casual jokes at others' expense, and even apologized to her in private for the way he had treated her earlier in the year. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was a start. And that, Alana realized, was what mattered. In the assembly, Alana was asked to speak about the event and its impact. As she stood at the front of the room, facing her classmates, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. She had done what she set out to do, not just confront an injustice, but create a space for others to see it too. "I know we're not done yet," she began, her voice steady. "And I know there are still a lot of things we need to work on. But I want to thank all of you who were willing to listen, to open up, and to have the hard conversations. It's easy to ignore what makes us uncomfortable. It's easy to pretend that things are fine when they're not. But we're here today because we've chosen to face those uncomfortable truths." She paused, looking around at the sea of faces, and that's the first step in creating change. Not pretending things are perfect, but being willing to change ourselves. We can't change everything in one day, but we can start. And that's enough. The room was silent for a moment, before the applause began. Soft at first, then louder, more sincere. It wasn't the kind of applause that celebrated a victory. It wasn't the kind of applause that acknowledged the completion of a task. It was the kind of applause that marked the beginning of something more, something ongoing. As Alana walked back to her seat, she felt a sense of fulfillment, not because the work was done, but because she had taken the first steps in making her school, her community, and her world a better place. She had spoken up when it mattered, and in doing so, had shown others that their voices, too, had power. The path ahead wasn't always clear, and there would be more obstacles to face. But Alana knew one thing for sure. Change, even if it was slow and quiet, was always worth fighting for. And sometimes, all it took to start that change was a single, courageous voice. Her voice. As the school year ended and students went their separate ways for the summer, Alana walked out of the building with a newfound confidence. She had started something that would continue to grow, a movement sparked not by anger, but by a deep, unwavering belief in the power of understanding and dialogue. It wasn't the end of her journey, it was just the beginning. In the end, Alana had learned the most important lesson of all. Change wasn't just about fighting battles, it was about showing up, again and again, facing the discomfort, speaking the truth, and working together with others to build a better future. The real power, she realized, was in the collective effort, the unity that came when people stood side by side and committed to change, no matter how long it took. Alana had found her voice, and in finding it, she had inspired others to find theirs. And together, they would make the world a little bit better, one conversation at a time. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.